A 4-year-old girl points at a photograph splashed across every gossip site in the city and asks her billionaire father one simple question: Daddy, why does that lady want to take Grace away from us? What Ethan Calloway doesn't know yet is that this single picture, snapped by a stranger on a quiet lakeside afternoon, has just handed his late wife's sister the exact weapon she spent 2 years waiting for. Stay with me to the end, hit like, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The rain had been coming down on Lake Calloway since 4 in the morning, and Ethan Calloway stood at the window of his study watching it streak the glass like the house itself was crying for him. He'd stopped sleeping well 2 years ago. Not completely. He wasn't dramatic enough to claim he never slept, but, well, the kind where you wake up and don't immediately remember the exact sound of your wife's voice the last time she said your name. That kind of sleep he hadn't had since Diane died. He was 32 years old, worth more money than most countries had circulating in a year, and he stood in a house with 11 bedrooms, feeling like the loneliest man on the eastern seaboard. Downstairs, his daughter was screaming. Not the bad kind of screaming. He'd learned the difference fast as a single father. There was scared screaming, and there was hurt screaming, and there was the third kind, which was the kind Emma was doing right now, which was just being 4 years old and furious that someone had taken away her cereal bowl before she'd finished arranging the marshmallows by color. "Emma Rose Calloway," came a voice from the kitchen, calm in a way Ethan's own voice hadn't managed to be in longer than he wanted to admit. "You can be mad at me. That's allowed, but you cannot throw the spoon." "I didn't throw it. It fell. It fell real hard in the direction of my head." There was a pause, then grudgingly, "Sorry." "Thank you. Now eat the marshmallows whatever color they want to be. Life's too short to sort marshmallows, kid." Ethan found himself smiling. He didn't notice he was doing it until his cheeks ached slightly from the unfamiliar use, and that small ache told him something he'd been avoiding admitting for weeks. This was the first time all week he'd smiled without forcing it. He walked downstairs in his socks, quiet on the cold marble, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching Grace Foster wipe spilled milk off the counter with one hand while balancing Emma's juice cup out of grabbing range with the other. She had her hair pulled back in a messy knot, an apron over jeans that had been mended at the knee more than once, and she was laughing, actually laughing, head tipped back, at something Emma had said. Grace had been in their lives for 4 months now. Ethan had hired her through an agency after firing 2 nannies in a row, both of whom had treated Emma like a job to be managed, rather than a little girl who'd lost her mother and needed someone to actually look at her. Grace had walked into the interview wearing a coat that was a size too big and shoes that had clearly seen better winters, and she'd talked to Emma, not about her, around her, the way the others had, but directly to her, crouched down at her eye level, asking what her favorite color was and whether she liked dinosaurs or unicorns better. "Both," Emma had said immediately. "Why would I pick?" "Exactly right," Grace had said. "Never let anyone make you choose just one good thing." Ethan had hired her on the spot. Now, 4 months later, he leaned in the doorway and said, "She giving you trouble?" Grace turned, startled, milk rag still in hand. "Mr. Calloway, I didn't hear you." "Ethan," he said, for what had to be the 40th time. "You've been here 4 months. I think we're past the Mr. Calloway thing." "Old habits," Grace said, but she said it with a small smile and went back to wiping the counter. "Daddy?" "Grace said marshmallows don't have to be sorted," Emma announced, as if reporting breaking news. "She said life's too short." "Grace is a very wise woman." "Grace is hungry and tired of arguing about cereal," Grace said, but she ruffled Emma's hair when she said it, and Emma leaned into the touch the way she used to lean into her mother, and Ethan had to look away for a second because something in his chest had gone tight and warm at the same time, which was a confusing combination of feelings he hadn't fully sorted out yet. He poured himself coffee he didn't really want just to have something to do with his hands. "We're still doing the lake thing today?" Grace asked. "If the rain stops?" "Forecast says it clears by noon," Ethan said. "Emma's been asking about the boat since Tuesday." "I want to drive the boat," Emma said. "You are 4, you will not be driving the boat." "I want to steer the boat." "That's also not happening, but I admire the negotiation." Grace laughed again, and Ethan thought, not for the first time, that the sound of her laughing had become one of the only things in this enormous, echoing house that didn't sound lonely. By noon, the rain had cleared into one of those impossibly blue late July afternoons where the lake looked like it had been polished. Ethan kept a modest boathouse on the property, modest by his standards, which meant it was still nicer than most people's actual houses. And he'd had the staff prep the little wooden runabout that had been his father's, the one he'd learned to fish from as a boy. Emma sat at the front of the boat in a bright orange life vest that was slightly too big for her, narrating everything she saw with the seriousness of a nature documentary host. "That's a duck. That's a different duck. That's a big rock that looks like a dog." "It does look like a dog," Grace agreed, sitting beside her, sunglasses pushed up into her hair. Ethan steered slowly along the shoreline, in no hurry to get anywhere, which was a feeling so foreign to him that he almost didn't recognize it. He ran a foundation, 3 companies, and a household, and somewhere in the last hour he'd stopped checking his phone, which his assistant would later tell him was a personal record. They stopped near a small public dock where a family was setting up a picnic, and Emma insisted on getting out to look at a turtle sunning itself on a rock. Ethan carried her on his shoulders while Grace walked beside them, and for about 10 minutes, on a public dock in the middle of a Tuesday, nothing about Ethan Calloway's life felt complicated. That was when the woman approached, mid-40s, friendly enough, holding up her phone. "Sorry to bother you. You 3 just look so sweet together. Would you mind if I took a picture?" "My daughter's about her age," the woman said, gesturing at Emma. "It's just a nice moment, you know?" Grace looked instinctively at Ethan, the kind of look that asked, "Is this okay? Should we say no? What do you want me to do?" Ethan had learned, in 2 years of being recognized in restaurants and airports, and once, humiliatingly, in a hospital waiting room, that the easiest way through these moments was to just say yes and move on quickly. "Sure," he said. "Quick one." The woman snapped 2 photos, Emma on Ethan's shoulders, Grace standing close beside them both, the lake glittering behind them, thanked them, and walked off without asking a single question about who they were. Just a woman who thought a father and a mother and a little girl looked sweet together on a summer afternoon. It wasn't until they were walking back to the boat that Grace said quietly, "She thought we were a family." Ethan didn't answer right away. He set Emma down gently so she could run ahead toward the dock, chasing a butterfly that had no interest in being chased, and for a second he just watched his daughter laughing in the sunlight, the way she hadn't laughed much in the year after Diane. "Would that be so bad?" he said finally. "If people thought that?" Grace's hands went still at her sides. "Ethan, I'm not saying anything by it," he said quickly, though even as the words left his mouth he knew that wasn't entirely true. "I just mean, she looks at you like—" He stopped himself, exhaled, tried again. "She hasn't looked at anyone like that since her mother. Not me, not her grandmother, you. I take care of her, that's the job." "I know what the job is, Grace." His voice came out softer than he meant it to. "I'm just saying maybe it stopped being only that a while ago." The wind moved across the lake, pushing Grace's hair across her face, and she didn't answer for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had something careful in it, something guarded that Ethan had noticed before but never quite understood the reason for. "I should get her back before she falls in trying to catch that butterfly." She walked away before he could say anything else, jogging lightly to scoop Emma up just as the little girl leaned dangerously close to the water's edge, and Ethan stood alone on the dock for a moment, feeling like he'd said either too much or not nearly enough, and unable to tell which. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the house had gone quiet in that particular way old houses do at night, Ethan found Grace in the kitchen again, this time making tea instead of cleaning up cereal. She'd changed out of her sundress into an old sweater, sleeves pushed up, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's activities and everything to do with something heavier she was carrying. "You don't have to make tea down here," he said. "There's a kettle in your room." "I like this kitchen better. Reminds me of my grandmother's, a little. Big windows." She poured water over the tea bag and didn't look at him. "You don't have to check on me either." "I'm not checking on you. I live here." That got a small, reluctant laugh out of her. Fair point. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to, whether I say yes or not." Why did it bother you so much? Today? On the dock? He kept his voice gentle, the way he might with Emma when she was upset about something she couldn't quite explain. The woman thinking we were a family. Grace wrapped both hands around her mug, staring down into it like the tea leaves might tell her what to say. Because it's not my place to want that, she said finally. And I do. Want it. That's the problem. The honesty of it landed in the room like something physical. Ethan felt his pulse pick up in a way he hadn't felt in 2 years. Not since before Diane got sick, back when wanting something simple and good still felt possible. Grace? You're my employer, she said, cutting him off, though not unkindly. You pay me to take care of your daughter. If I let myself want more than that, and it goes wrong, I don't just lose a job, Ethan. I lose her. I lose Emma. And I can't. Her voice cracked slightly, and she pressed her lips together to steady it. I can't lose another kid I love. I won't survive that twice. It was the first time she'd ever said anything about a first time, and Ethan caught it instantly, the way you catch a single loose thread in fabric that's about to unravel. What do you mean, twice? Grace's eyes flicked up to his, and for just a second, something old and painful moved behind them before she shut it away again, the way Ethan recognized because he did the exact same thing every time someone mentioned Diane's name too casually. It's not a story for tonight, she said quietly. Good night, Ethan. She left the tea half finished on the counter and went upstairs, and Ethan stood alone in the kitchen for a long time afterward, turning over the strange, unfinished shape of what she'd just told him, wondering what exactly had happened to Grace Foster before she walked into his life with a coat too big for her and a way of looking at his daughter like she already loved her. He didn't know yet that somewhere across the city, in a penthouse apartment with a view almost as good as his own, his late wife's sister was sitting at her dining table with her laptop open to a single photograph, a billionaire, a nanny, and a little girl laughing together on a public dock, and a slow, satisfied smile was spreading across her face. Vanessa Holloway had been waiting 2 years for exactly this kind of mistake. The photograph appeared online 3 days later. Not on any major outlet, just a small local lifestyle blog that covered the lake community, the kind of harmless site that posted about farmers markets and boat shows. The caption was innocent enough. Spotted. Billionaire Ethan Calloway enjoys a sweet family day with his daughter and what appears to be a new woman in his life. It shouldn't have mattered. It was one photo on one small blog with maybe 2,000 readers on a good day. But Vanessa Holloway had spent 2 years learning exactly which small fires, fed correctly, could burn down an entire house. By the following Monday, 3 larger gossip sites had picked up the story, each one adding their own speculative headline. Grieving widower falls for the help. Calloway's mystery nanny romance. Sources say Billionaire's new relationship has family worried. Ethan found out about the third headline from his lawyer, who called him at 7 in the morning, sounding more rattled than Ethan had ever heard him. Ethan, you need to see this before you go anywhere today. See what? There's a story running about you and Ms. Foster, and it's not just gossip anymore. Someone's quoted as a family source raising concerns about Emma's home environment. Ethan, I think this is coming from inside the family. Ethan sat up in bed, the early light cutting through his curtains, and felt the particular kind of cold settle into his stomach that he hadn't felt since the night the hospital called about Diane. Vanessa, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I can't confirm that, his lawyer said, but I'd start acting like it's true. Downstairs, he could hear Emma already awake, laughing at something, Grace's voice answering her in that warm, unhurried way she had. The sound of a house that had finally started feeling like a home again. Ethan stood at his window for a long moment, looking down at the lake that had seemed so peaceful just days ago, and understood with a sinking certainty that whatever quiet happiness they'd built in this house over the last 4 months was about to be tested by something far uglier than gossip. Somewhere out there, Vanessa Holloway was just getting started. Vanessa Holloway's apartment smelled like the inside of a florist's refrigerator. White lilies in a vase she changed every 3 days, because she'd read once that lilies signaled refinement, and refinement was a costume Vanessa had been wearing so long she sometimes forgot it wasn't her actual skin. She sat at her dining table at 8 in the morning with her laptop open, scrolling through the comment sections under the third article about her brother-in-law and his mystery nanny, and she felt something close to peace for the first time in 2 years. Diane had been her younger sister, smarter, kinder, the one their mother had always preferred without ever quite admitting it out loud, and the one who'd married a man worth more money than Vanessa would see in 10 lifetimes. Vanessa had told herself for years that she didn't resent that she loved Diane, that she was happy for her sister's good fortune. She told herself that right up until the funeral, standing in the back of the church in a black dress that cost more than most people's rent, watching Ethan Calloway hold his daughter against his chest and weep in a way that made every person in that room ache for him. And Vanessa had felt, underneath her own genuine grief, something colder and more practical taking root. Emma was the last Calloway heir. Emma's trust, structured the way Diane's father had structured it decades ago, named family members as contingency guardians should anything happen to Ethan, and named the Family Foundation's board, which Vanessa had spent 2 years quietly populating with people who owed her favors, as the body that would oversee Emma's upbringing if Ethan were ever deemed unfit. Unfit. It was such a flexible word, if you had the right lawyers and the right friends, and the right amount of patience. Vanessa had been patient. She'd spent 2 years showing up for Sunday dinners, sending Emma birthday gifts that cost more than Grace Foster's monthly salary, sitting on the foundation board and saying very little, waiting for an opening. She hadn't expected the opening to be quite this easy. A photograph. A nanny who looked at a billionaire's daughter like she actually loved her, which was, Vanessa thought, almost laughably convenient, because nothing made people nervous faster than a poor woman getting close to a rich man's heart. Her phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Chen, one of the 7 trustees on the foundation board, a woman Vanessa had helped get appointed 18 months earlier in exchange for a donation to her husband's failing gallery. "Have you seen the Tribune piece? People are asking questions." Vanessa smiled and typed back, "I have. It's concerning, isn't it? I think we should discuss Emma's well-being at the next board meeting." She set the phone down, picked up her coffee, and looked out at the city skyline with the satisfied expression of a woman watching dominoes she'd spent 2 years setting up finally begin, very gently, to fall. Back at the lake house, the morning had not gone gently for anyone. Ethan had spent an hour on the phone with his head of communications, a sharp, exhausted woman named Priya, who kept saying the word narrative so many times that Ethan started to feel like his entire life had become a plot summary written by someone else. "The story right now is sympathetic widower, opportunistic young employee," Priya said. "That's the frame 3 of these outlets are running with. We need to either kill the story completely or control it before someone connects it to internal foundation politics." "There is no internal foundation politics," Ethan said, though even as he said it, his lawyer's words from that morning sat heavy in his chest. "I think this is coming from inside the family." "Ethan." Priya's voice softened slightly, which from her was practically an alarm bell because Priya did not soften. "Is there anything happening with you and Ms. Foster that I should know about before I build a strategy around denying it?" Ethan was quiet for a moment too long. "There's nothing happening," he said. "Not officially." "Unofficially?" "I don't know yet, Priya. Can we focus on the part where strangers on the internet are deciding whether my daughter's home is stable?" Priya let it go, because that was her job, but Ethan could hear in the silence after that she'd noted his answer and filed it away the way professionals like her always did, for later, for context, for the version of this story that might need managing down the line. He hung up and sat at his desk for a long time, staring at his closed laptop, not wanting to open it and see what new headline had appeared since the last time he'd checked. Eventually he did anyway, because not knowing was somehow worse than knowing, and he found a new article, this one from a slightly larger outlet, with a headline that made his stomach drop: "Calloway Foundation Trustees Monitoring Situation, Amid Concerns Over Heir's Home Life." There it was. Not gossip anymore. The board. He picked up his phone and called the foundation's executive director, a steady, no-nonsense man named Walter Briggs, who'd worked for Ethan's father before Ethan was even born. "Walter, what's going on with the board?" "Ethan," Walter's voice had the careful tone of a man choosing words with tweezers. "There's been some discussion. Nothing formal. A few trustees have raised concerns off the record about Emma's domestic situation given the press coverage. Concerns from who specifically? A pause. Margaret Chen brought it up first. But I should tell you, Vanessa's been talking to several of the newer trustees quite a bit over the last year. I didn't think much of it at the time. Family members showing interest seemed natural. Ethan closed his eyes. How many of the newer trustees did she bring on, Walter? Another pause, longer this time. 4, out of 7 total. The number landed like a stone dropping through still water, sending out ripples Ethan could already feel reaching every corner of his life. Grace heard most of this secondhand, in fragments, the way people without power usually learn about decisions being made above their heads. She heard it in the way the housekeeper, Dolores, went quiet whenever Grace walked into a room where the television was on. She heard it in the strange, clipped politeness of the 2 trustees who called the house directly, asking to speak with Ethan about scheduling, their voices carrying a chill that had nothing to do with scheduling at all. And she heard it, most painfully, from Emma herself, who came to her one afternoon with a tablet she wasn't supposed to have unsupervised access to, the screen open to one of the articles, a photo of Grace's own face circled in red beside a headline asking whether she was good enough to be trusted around a billionaire's child. Grace, Emma said, holding up the tablet with the seriousness of someone presenting evidence in a trial, why does that lady want to take you away from us? Grace's whole body went cold. She knelt down, gently took the tablet, and set it face down on the counter before answering, buying herself a few seconds to find a voice steady enough for a 4-year-old. Nobody's taking me anywhere, sweetheart, she said. Where did you find this? Daddy left it open on his computer. I wasn't trying to look at bad stuff. I was trying to find the dinosaur game. It's okay. You're not in trouble. Grace pulled her into a hug, partly for Emma's comfort, and partly because she needed a moment to hide her own face, to keep Emma from seeing whatever expression was currently sitting on it. Sometimes grown-ups write mean things on the internet that aren't true. That's all this is. Is it about you and Daddy? Grace pulled back just enough to look at her. Emma's eyes, Diane's eyes, by every account Grace had heard, though she'd never met the woman, were wide and worried in a way that made something in Grace's chest twist painfully. It's complicated, Grace said, which was the most honest answer she had. I don't want it to be complicated, Emma said. I want you to stay. Oh, baby. Grace pulled her back into the hug, blinking hard, and over Emma's small shoulder she caught sight of Ethan standing in the doorway, having clearly heard the entire exchange, his face doing something complicated of its own. That night, after Emma was finally asleep, Ethan found Grace on the back patio, sitting on the porch steps with her knees pulled up, looking out at the lake gone dark and silver under a half moon. I'm sorry she saw that, he said, sitting down beside her, leaving a careful, deliberate distance between them. I should have closed the laptop. I wasn't thinking. It's not your fault. Grace kept her eyes on the water. It was going to find her eventually. Kids find everything eventually. I talked to Walter today, the foundation's executive director. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking older than 32, looking like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for longer than 2 years. 4 of the 7 trustees were appointed with Vanessa's involvement. I didn't even put that together until today. Grace turned to look at him. Your sister-in-law. My late wife's sister, yes. He said it carefully, the way people speak around old wounds they're not sure have fully closed. I should have seen this coming. She spent 2 years being so quiet about everything, so present, and I told myself that was grief. Maybe some of it was, but I think some of it was also... He stopped, exhaled hard. Waiting. Waiting for what? For me to give her something to use. He looked at her then, and Grace felt the weight of his gaze even in the dim light, felt it land somewhere she hadn't let anyone touch in a very long time. I think the photograph gave her exactly that. Grace wrapped her arms tighter around her knees. Then maybe I should go, she said quietly, before it gets worse, before it touches Emma any more than it already has. Grace, I mean it, Ethan. If me being here is what they're using to attack your fitness as a father, then me leaving fixes that. It's simple. It's not simple. His voice had an edge to it now, frustration breaking through the careful calm he usually kept. Nothing about this is simple, and running from it doesn't make it disappear. It just gives Vanessa exactly what she wants without her even having to fight for it. And what is it she wants exactly? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, gone rougher around the edges. Control of the foundation, of Emma's trust. Maybe even of Emma herself, if she thinks she can position herself as some kind of stabilizing family figure once she's pushed you out and made me look unstable enough to need oversight. The word Emma, sitting at the center of that sentence, made Grace's stomach turn over. She thought of the little girl currently asleep upstairs, 4 years old, having already lost her mother, now potentially being used as a chess piece in a fight she had no understanding of and no say in. "I won't let that happen," Grace said, and she was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, the certainty of it. "Whatever I have to do, I won't let anyone use that little girl to win some kind of power fight." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, something that looked almost like relief mixed with something else entirely, something neither of them was ready to name out loud yet. "Why does this matter so much to you?" he asked quietly. "You've been here 4 months, Grace. You could leave tomorrow and start fresh somewhere with none of this following you. Why fight for a family that isn't legally yours?" Grace looked back out at the lake, and for a long moment Ethan thought she wasn't going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone thin and careful, like she was handling something fragile. "Because I had a little girl once who needed me, and I wasn't allowed to stay," she said. "And I've spent 4 years wondering if I could have fought harder, if I should have." Ethan went very still. "What happened?" Grace closed her eyes briefly. "It's a long story, and it's not a good one. I have time. It's late." "Grace." He said her name gently but firmly, the way he might if he genuinely needed her to look at him. And when she finally did, he held her gaze steady. "I'm not asking because I'm trying to dig something up to use against you. I'm asking because I want to understand you, all of you, not just the parts that are easy." Grace studied him for a long moment in the moonlight, and something in his expression, open, unguarded, none of the careful corporate calm he wore during the day, seemed to convince her of something. She took a breath, the kind people take before stepping into deep water. "Before I came here, I worked for a family in the city," she said. "The Whitfields. I was their daughter's nanny, Lily. She was 3 when I started, 5 when I left. I loved that little girl the way I love Emma, maybe more, because she was the first child I'd ever cared for like that, and I didn't know yet how much it would cost me to love someone else's kid that hard." "What happened?" "Mr. Whitfield happened." Grace's jaw tightened, and even 4 years later, Ethan could see the old anger still alive in her, banked but not extinguished. "He started finding reasons to be home when I was working. Comments at first. Then it got worse. I told him to stop. He didn't. I told his wife, and she didn't believe me, or didn't want to, because believing me meant believing something about her marriage she wasn't ready to face. So instead, they decided the easier story was that I'd misread things, that I was unstable, that I'd made advances toward him, if you can believe that. They fired me within the week, and they made sure every other family in their circle heard their version first." "Grace. I tried for 8 months to find another nanny position after that," she continued, her voice gaining a brittle steadiness, the kind that comes from telling a story you've rehearsed alone in the dark too many times. "Nobody would hire me. The Whitfields had friends everywhere, and their version of events traveled faster and further than mine ever could. I lost my apartment, I lost most of my savings, and I lost Lily, who I genuinely believe to this day didn't understand why I disappeared from her life with no warning, no goodbye, nothing. I think about that little girl's face more than I think about almost anything else from that year." Ethan sat with that for a long moment, feeling something hot and protective rise up in his chest, an anger on her behalf that surprised him with its intensity. "That's why the agency listed such a short employment history before me," he said slowly, putting pieces together. "I remember asking about the gap. I told the agency the truth. They believed me, eventually, enough to still place me, but they warned me most families wouldn't dig deep enough to find the real story. They'd just see a gap and a vague explanation and decide I was a risk." She looked at him directly now. So if your sister-in-law is digging into my past, Ethan, she is going to find that story, and she is going to tell her own version of it, exactly the way the Whitfields did. And no matter how much it isn't true, it is going to look bad enough on paper to do real damage. Ethan absorbed this in silence, his jaw working, and Grace watched him carefully, waiting for the moment his expression might shift into doubt, into the careful, distancing look people gave her once they heard this story, the look that said, maybe there's something to it, after all. It never came. Then we get ahead of it, he said instead, his voice hard with a kind of resolve Grace hadn't heard from him before, not even when he talked about the board. We don't wait for Vanessa to weaponize this. I'll have my attorney pull together a full account. Your old agency's records, any communication from the Whitfield staff, who might back up what actually happened, anything that shows the truth, instead of whatever twisted version she's going to try to sell. Ethan, you don't have to do that. I want to. He reached over, finally closing the distance between them, and took her hand in his thumb moving slowly over her knuckles in a way that made her breath catch slightly. Grace, I have spent 2 years thinking the worst thing that could happen to this family already happened. I lost Diane, and I genuinely believed nothing after that could hurt as badly. But watching you almost decide to walk away tonight to protect Emma and protect me, at the cost of your own happiness, that scared me more than I expected it to. Grace's eyes were wet now, and she didn't bother hiding it. I don't want to be the reason this family falls apart. You're not the reason, Ethan said firmly. Vanessa is the reason. You're the reason this house has felt like a home again. Don't confuse the two. They sat together on the porch steps for a long while after that, not talking, just present in the quiet, the lake breathing softly in the dark in front of them. And for the first time since the photograph had appeared online, Grace let herself believe just slightly that they might survive this. Cha. She should have known better than to believe it would be that simple. The call came 3 days later, while Ethan was in the city for an emergency meeting with the foundation board, a meeting Vanessa had requested, citing urgent matters concerning Emma's welfare that needed immediate discussion. Grace was alone at the lake house with Emma, the two of them building an elaborate blanket fort in the living room, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Is this Grace Foster? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, faintly amused in a way that made the hair on Grace's arms stand up before the woman had even finished her sentence. Who is this? Vanessa Holloway. I think it's time we talked, woman to woman. No need for Ethan to be involved just yet. Grace's grip tightened on the phone. She glanced over at Emma, who was happily arranging stuffed animals along the inside wall of the fort, oblivious to the conversation happening 6 feet away. I don't think we have anything to talk about, Grace said carefully. I think we have quite a lot to talk about, actually. Vanessa's voice carried the smooth, practiced cadence of someone who'd spent a career getting exactly what she wanted from conversations like this. I know about the Whitfields, Grace. I know what really happened there. And I also know how easy it would be to make sure a very different version of that story reaches every newspaper, every trustee, every parent at Emma's future school. I know things about people's past that they've worked very hard to bury, and I am extremely good at deciding when those things resurface. Grace's mouth had gone dry. Is that a threat? It's an opportunity, Vanessa said pleasantly, as if she were offering Grace a business deal rather than blackmail. Meet me. Tomorrow afternoon, somewhere private. I think you'll find what I have to say is actually in your best interest. In everyone's best interest, really, including Emma's. Grace looked again at the little girl in the blanket fort, 4 years old, narrating an elaborate adventure to her stuffed animals, completely unaware that 2 grown women miles apart were already negotiating pieces of her future. Fine, Grace said quietly. Tomorrow. Tell me where. She hung up the phone with hands that weren't quite steady and stood in the doorway of the living room for a long moment, watching Emma play, feeling the full weight of what was coming settle over her like a stone dropped into still water, the same kind of weight she remembered feeling 4 years ago, in the days right before the Whitfields decided her love for their daughter wasn't enough to outweigh the inconvenience of her telling the truth. She wasn't going to let it happen the same way twice. Whatever Vanessa Holloway was about to offer her tomorrow, Grace already knew, with a cold and steady certainty settling into her chest, that she wasn't going to walk away from this family quietly, not without a fight. She just didn't yet know how dangerous that fight was about to become. The cafe Vanessa had chosen sat 3 blocks from the Foundation's headquarters, the kind of place with exposed brick and $8 lattes, where nobody important enough to recognize either of them would think to look twice. Grace arrived 10 minutes early, the way she always did when she was nervous, and chose a table in the back corner where she could see the door. Vanessa arrived exactly on time, dressed in cream-colored linen that probably cost more than Grace made in 2 months. And she sat down across from Grace with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who already considered the conversation won before it started. "Thank you for coming," Vanessa said, setting her phone face up on the table between them in a way that felt deliberate, like a loaded gun left in plain sight. "I know this isn't easy." "Let's skip the part where you pretend to care how I feel," Grace said. "What do you want?" Vanessa's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Direct. I respect that, actually. Most people in your position try to charm me first." She folded her hands on the table. "Here's the situation, Grace, and I want to be honest with you because I think you're smart enough to appreciate honesty, even when it's unflattering. Ethan is a good man who's spent 2 years grieving badly, and grieving people make impulsive choices. He's gotten attached to you. I understand why. You're kind to his daughter, you're easy to be around. You fill a silence in that house that's been empty since my sister died. None of that makes you dangerous on its own. Then what does? What makes you dangerous is what happens when this becomes public the way these things eventually become public. A grieving billionaire falling for his daughter's nanny, a woman with a documented history of accusing a previous employer of misconduct." Vanessa let the sentence hang there, watching Grace's face carefully for a reaction. "I know how that story gets told, Grace. I've watched stories like that get told my whole career. It doesn't matter what actually happened with the Whitfields. It matters what's easy to believe, and a poor woman who's accused 2 wealthy men of misconduct in 2 separate jobs is a very easy story to believe, whether it's fair or not." Grace felt her hands curl into fists beneath the table, nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. "That's not what happened, and you know it." "I know what the documents will say if I decide to make them public," Vanessa said simply. "And I know what a foundation board full of people I've spent 2 years cultivating relationships with will decide to believe, especially once they're worried about protecting a 4-year-old's reputation alongside her father's. People don't need the truth, Grace. They need a story that lets them feel like they did the responsible thing." The casual cruelty of it, delivered in such an unbothered tone, made something cold settle in Grace's stomach. She thought of Emma's small hands gripping the tablet, asking why a stranger wanted to take Grace away, and she had to force herself to breathe slowly before she spoke again. "Why are you doing this? Emma is your niece, your sister's daughter. Don't you care what this does to her?" Something flickered behind Vanessa's composed expression. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it, gone almost before Grace could be sure she'd seen it at all. "I loved my sister," Vanessa said, and for the first time her voice lost some of its polish. "I loved her more than anyone in this family ever understood, including her own husband. And I have spent 2 years watching him build a new life in the house she decorated, with a new woman in the kitchen she used to bake in, while Emma calls someone else Grace in the exact tone she used to call her mother Mama. You think this is about money for me?" She let out a short, brittle laugh. "I have more money than I'll ever spend. This is about making sure Diane's daughter is raised by people who actually understand what that family is supposed to be, not by whoever happened to be convenient when Ethan was lonely enough to stop thinking clearly." For one disorienting moment, Grace almost felt something like sympathy for her. Grief did strange things to people. She knew that better than most, having watched it hollow out the Whitfields' marriage long before any of what happened to her even began. But sympathy curdled fast into something harder when Vanessa reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. "Here's what I'm offering," Vanessa said, all business again. "You resign, quietly. No scandal, no public statement beyond something simple about wanting to pursue other opportunities. In exchange, you receive a settlement, generous, more than generous, enough to start completely fresh somewhere far from here, and a professional reference that makes absolutely no mention of anything regarding Ethan or the Whitfields. You disappear with money and a clean record. That's the good outcome, Grace. I'm offering you the good outcome. Grace opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a document outlining a settlement figure that made her breath catch despite everything. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. Enough to pay off every debt from the Whitfield disaster, enough to rebuild completely. And if I say no? Vanessa's expression didn't change, which somehow made the answer worse. Then I take everything I know about the Whitfields to 3 different outlets simultaneously, framed in the worst possible light, and I bring it to the board alongside a formal recommendation that Emma's home environment be evaluated by an independent custody specialist given, quote, serious concerns about the father's judgment and the caregiver's documented history of workplace misconduct allegations. I have 4 trustees who will vote however I tell them to vote, Grace. Ethan will spend the next year in court instead of with his daughter. His name will be dragged through exactly the kind of press he's spent his entire career avoiding, and at the end of it, even if he wins, Emma will have spent a year watching her father fight to keep her instead of simply being allowed to raise her. She let that settle in the air between them before adding, almost gently, like she actually believed she was being kind. You do that to them? For your own pride? When I'm handing you a way out that costs them nothing and saves you completely? Grace stared down at the folder, at the number that represented a version of safety she'd stopped believing was possible for herself 4 years ago, and felt the old, familiar shape of a decision she'd made once before pressing against her chest. Walk away. Don't fight. Protect the child even if it costs you everything. I need to think about it, she said quietly. Of course. Vanessa stood, smoothing her linen jacket, entirely composed, entirely unbothered, the way people are when they've never once doubted they'll get what they want. But not too long, Grace. The board meets again in 5 days. I'd prefer to resolve this before then, for everyone's sake. She paused at the edge of the table, looking down at Grace with something that might have almost been pity. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you got caught in something bigger than you, the same way you got caught with the Whitfields. Some women just have bad luck with powerful men's families. It's not really your fault. It's just how it goes. She left, and Grace sat alone at the table for a long time afterward, the folder open in front of her, her tea gone cold, replaying every word until they blurred together into one single, suffocating thought. Here it is again. The moment where loving a child you're not allowed to keep costs you everything. She didn't go straight home. She walked for almost an hour through streets she didn't really see, until she found herself standing outside a small public library 3 blocks from the cafe, and something about the quiet, the familiar smell of old paper and dust made her finally able to breathe normally again. She sat on a bench outside and called the one person she trusted enough to call before deciding anything. Dolores, she said when the housekeeper picked up, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Grace, what's wrong? You sound terrible. Vanessa met with me today. She offered me money to leave quietly and threatened to destroy Ethan's custody of Emma if I don't. Saying it out loud made it feel even more real, even more impossible. Dolores, I don't know what to do. There was a long pause on the other end, and when Dolores spoke again, her voice had gone hard in a way Grace had never heard from the gentle older woman before. Listen to me, Dolores said. I have worked for this family for 11 years. I was here when Diane was alive. I was here the night she died. And I have watched that man and that little girl try to crawl their way back to something that looks like a life ever since. I have also watched Vanessa Holloway circle this family like a vulture for 2 years, smiling at every dinner, asking sweet questions about Emma's school, while quietly never missing a single board meeting she had no real reason to attend. I do not trust that woman, Grace, and I never have. She has evidence about my past, real evidence, things that actually happened, just twisted to look worse than they are. And does Ethan know? About your past, the real version. Yes, I told him everything. Then let him decide what to do with that, instead of deciding it for him. Dolores's voice softened slightly. You think you're protecting that family by disappearing quietly, Grace, but you're really just doing what Vanessa wants without making her work for it. If she's threatening you this hard, it's because she's scared of something. People that confident don't usually need to threaten anyone unless they're afraid of what happens if they don't. Grace sat with that for a long moment, watching pigeons scatter across the library steps, something in Dolores's words clicking into place that she hadn't let herself consider yet. Afraid of what, though? What does she have to lose if I just walk away? That, Dolores said, is exactly the question I think you should be asking, instead of the one Vanessa wants you asking. Come home, Grace. Talk to Ethan. Don't let her decide this story alone. Ethan was already pacing the front hall when Grace's car pulled up the long driveway, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and tense in a way that told her the board meeting hadn't gone well even before she stepped through the door. I have to go, he said into the phone when he saw her, hanging up without waiting for a response. Grace, where have you been? I tried calling twice. I had to think, she said. Ethan, Vanessa called me yesterday. She wanted to meet today. I just got back from seeing her. His expression shifted immediately, alarm replacing exhaustion. What did she say to you? Grace told him everything. The cafe, the folder, the settlement offer, the threat about the Whitfields, the 5-day deadline before the board meeting. She watched his face go through several emotions in quick succession, disbelief, then anger, then something colder and more focused that she hadn't seen from him before. She offered you money to disappear, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. A lot of money, Ethan, enough to actually start over. And if you said no? She threatened to release the Whitfield story to the press and push the board toward a custody evaluation, claiming concerns about your judgment and my history. Grace wrapped her arms around herself. She made it sound almost reasonable, like she was doing me a favor. Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle working visibly beneath his skin. She's bluffing about the board having that kind of power. A custody evaluation requires actual grounds, not gossip. Does it matter if it's true if 4 trustees believe it anyway? You told me yourself she spent a year getting people loyal to her on that board. He didn't answer right away because they both already knew the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath that question. That in rooms full of powerful, frightened people trying to protect a foundation's reputation, the truth often mattered less than how convincing the story sounded. What did you tell her? He asked finally. I told her I needed to think about it. Grace looked at him directly. Ethan, I almost said yes. Standing in that cafe, looking at that number, for about 30 seconds, I genuinely considered just taking the money and disappearing, the same way I disappeared from the Whitfields. Because that's what I know how to do. Protect the kid by removing myself from the equation. But you didn't say yes. No. I called Dolores instead. Grace managed a small, tired smile. She asked me a question I couldn't stop thinking about the entire drive home. If Vanessa's this confident, why does she need to threaten anyone at all? Why not just let the gossip run its course and let the board make its own decision? Why come to me directly, privately, with money and a deadline? Something shifted behind Ethan's eyes, the gears of his mind visibly turning. Because she needs this resolved quickly, he said slowly, before something happens that she can't control. What kind of something? I don't know yet. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and a strange, dawning kind of hope mixing together on his face. But Walter mentioned something at the meeting today that I dismissed at the time because I was too angry to think clearly about it. He said 2 of the original trustees, the ones who'd been on the board for over a decade before Vanessa got involved, have been asking quiet questions about how some of the newer appointments were actually approved. Apparently, the bylaws require a unanimous vote from the existing board for new trustee appointments, and Walter said he's not entirely sure that happened the way it should have for at least 2 of Vanessa's people. Grace felt something sharpen inside her, the same instinct that had once made her keep careful notes about Mr. Whitfield's behavior, notes that nobody had wanted to believe but that she'd kept anyway, just in case. If those appointments weren't done properly, she said slowly, then any votes they cast on the board wouldn't actually be legitimate. No, Ethan said, they wouldn't be. They looked at each other for a long moment, the shape of a different fight, one that didn't end with Grace quietly disappearing, starting to take form between them. It took 3 days of careful, quiet work to find what they needed, and most of that work fell, unexpectedly, to Grace herself. She'd remembered something from her first week at the lake house, back before any of this had started, when Vanessa had visited for a Sunday dinner and left her phone behind on the side table in the study while she went to find Ethan in the garden. Grace had brought the phone out to her, nothing more than a polite gesture at the time, but she remembered, with a clarity that surprised her now, the screen lighting up briefly with a notification before she handed it over, an email subject line, glimpsed only for a second, something about trustee appointment documentation, urgent, do not CC Walter. She mentioned it to Ethan's attorney, a sharp, careful woman named Renata Cole, who Ethan had brought in specifically because she had no history with the foundation and therefore no loyalty to anyone but the facts. That's not enough on its own to act on, Renata said, sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop and a legal pad covered in handwriting Grace couldn't begin to decipher. But it gives us a place to start looking. If Vanessa was managing trustee appointments outside the normal channels, there should be a paper trail somewhere. Emails, signed consent forms, board minutes that don't match the actual voting record. How do we get access to any of that without tipping her off? Grace asked. Walter, Ethan said immediately. He's been with this foundation longer than I've been alive. If anyone has access to the original bylaws and the actual appointment records, it's him, and he already has suspicions of his own. Walter Briggs turned out to be exactly the ally they needed. A man in his 60s with decades of institutional memory and a quiet, simmering anger of his own at having been kept partially in the dark by someone he'd trusted enough to let manage administrative details. He should have been overseen more carefully himself. I should have caught this earlier, Walter admitted, spreading documents across the kitchen table on the fourth night, his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, his tie loosened after a long day of quietly pulling files he technically had every right to access, but had never needed to look at this closely before. Vanessa handled most of the administrative correspondence for new trustee onboarding over the last 18 months. I trusted her because she's family, and because, frankly, nobody else wanted to deal with the paperwork. That was my mistake. What did you find? Ethan asked, leaning over the table. 2 of the 4 trustees she sponsored, Margaret Chen and a man named Robert Stillwell, were never actually voted on by the full existing board the way the bylaws require. There are signed consent forms here, but look at the dates. Walter pointed to a series of signatures. These 3 older trustees supposedly signed off on Chen's and Stillwell's appointments on the same day, within 20 minutes of each other, despite the fact that according to my calendar from that period, 2 of them were traveling internationally and weren't even in the country that day. Grace felt her pulse quicken. She forged their signatures? I can't say that for certain without a handwriting expert, Walter said carefully, the caution of a man who'd spent his career being precise with language. But I can say these signatures don't match the consistent signature style I've seen from these 2 trustees on dozens of other documents over the years. The pressure's different, the letter formation's different. Something is wrong here, and I think a forensic document examiner would say the same thing. Ethan sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the full shape of what they might be looking at finally becoming clear. If she forged board approvals to get her own people appointed, that's not just unethical, that's fraud. That's enough to remove her from the board entirely, and it invalidates every vote those 2 trustees have cast since their appointment, including any vote they might cast at the upcoming meeting about Emma's custody situation, Renata added, looking up from her legal pad with the first genuine smile Grace had seen from her since she'd started working on this. Ethan, if we can prove this, Vanessa doesn't just lose her leverage. She loses her entire position on the board. The custody concerns dissolve because the people pushing them were never legitimately empowered to push them in the first place. For the first time in days, something like real hope moved through the room, fragile but unmistakable. But hope, Grace had learned a long time ago, was a dangerous thing to hold on to too tightly before you had proof solid enough to survive a fight. And they still needed something more concrete than suspicious signatures and a glimpsed email subject line. They needed Vanessa's own words, in her own hand, admitting what she'd done. They needed exactly the kind of evidence Grace hadn't realized, until the next morning, that she might already be sitting on. The text messages started arriving the day after Grace's deadline passed without an answer. I assume your silence means you've made your decision. I'm disappointed, Grace. I genuinely hoped you'd take the easier path for everyone's sake. Grace stared at the message for a long moment before responding carefully, choosing her words the way she imagined Renata might if she'd been looking over her shoulder. I haven't made a decision yet. I need more time. You don't have more time. The board meets in 2 days. If you want the settlement, I need your resignation letter by tomorrow morning, signed with the language my attorney provided. Another message arrived seconds later, this one sharper, more impatient. I'd hate for this to get messier than it needs to be. You know what I have access to, Grace. Don't make me use it. Grace's hands were shaking slightly as she read it again, but underneath the fear, something else was beginning to take shape. A cold, clear realization that Dolores's question from days earlier had been exactly the right one to ask. Vanessa wasn't behaving like a woman who held all the power. She was behaving like a woman who was running out of time and knew it. She brought her phone to Ethan immediately, finding him in his study with Renata and Walter still hunched over documents from the night before. The table now covered in printed emails and highlighted bank records that Walter had managed to pull, related to the gallery donation tied to Margaret Chen's appointment. Look at this, Grace said, holding out her phone. She's threatening me again, in writing this time, demanding a signed resignation by tomorrow morning. Renata took the phone carefully, scrolling through the message thread with the focused intensity of someone reading something far more valuable than its sender realized. This is good, she said slowly. This is very good, actually. Grace, has she sent anything else like this? Anything mentioning the settlement, the Whitfields, the threat about the board? There were messages from before, too, the night before our meeting, confirming the location, and after, following up about the deadline. I need every single one of those screenshots and the original message data if possible. Timestamps, everything. Renata's eyes had gone sharp with the kind of focus Grace imagined she got right before walking into a courtroom. Combined with what Walters found about the forged signatures, written threats from Vanessa herself, admitting to a bribery attempt and explicitly threatening to weaponize false custody concerns if Grace doesn't comply. That's not just suspicious anymore. That's a documented pattern of coercion and fraud, in her own words, sent from her own phone number. She's smart enough to know better than to put any of that in writing, Ethan said, frowning. Why would she risk it? Because she's confident, Walter said quietly. She spent 2 years not getting caught at anything. People who don't get caught for a long time start believing they're untouchable. They get careless. He looked at Grace with something close to respect. She thought she was threatening someone too desperate and too powerless to ever fight back. She didn't think you'd be smart enough to keep the evidence instead of just being scared by it. Grace looked down at her phone, at the message still glowing on the screen, demanding her silence and her disappearance by morning, and felt something settle inside her that hadn't been there in 4 years. Not since the night the Whitfields decided her truth wasn't worth believing. This time, she wasn't going anywhere quietly. Send her this, Grace said, looking at Ethan, her voice steadier than it had been in days. Tell her I'll have an answer for her by tomorrow morning, exactly like she wants. Ethan studied her face for a long moment, understanding immediately what she meant, what kind of answer she was actually planning to give. Grace, are you sure? Once we move on this, there's no taking it back. She'll fight this with everything she has. I'm sure, Grace's voice didn't waver. I spent 4 years regretting that I didn't fight harder for Lily. I'm not making that mistake twice. Whatever Vanessa throws at us tomorrow, we throw it right back. And this time, we have the truth on our side instead of just hoping someone chooses to believe it. Outside the study window, the lake sat dark and still under a clouded night sky. And somewhere across the city, Vanessa Holloway was almost certainly sitting in her own apartment, confident, satisfied, completely unaware that the woman she'd tried to buy and threaten into silence had just decided, with the quiet, unshakable resolve of someone who'd lost everything once before and refused to lose it the same way twice, to burn her entire carefully built plan to the ground. Renata Cole worked through the night with the kind of focused, unglamorous diligence that never makes it into the version of lawyers people see on television. No dramatic speeches, no slammed laptops, just hours of cross-referencing timestamps, organizing Vanessa's text messages into a chronological binder alongside Walter's forged signature documents, and building line by line, something that could survive a room full of skeptical trustees looking for any excuse to dismiss it. By 6 in the morning, she had what she needed. It's not just enough to embarrass her, Renata said, sliding the finished binder across the kitchen table to Ethan as the sun came up over the lake, gray light bleeding slowly into gold. This is enough to remove her from the board entirely, void every vote her appointees cast, and potentially open her up to criminal liability for the forged consent forms, depending on how aggressive you want to be. How aggressive can we be without dragging this into actual criminal court and turning it into exactly the kind of spectacle she's been trying to manufacture in the press? Ethan asked, rubbing his eyes, 3 cups of coffee deep into a night he hadn't slept through. That's the strategic question, Renata said. My recommendation is we present this to the full board first, privately, before her resignation deadline for Grace even arrives. Let the trustees see exactly what she's done to manipulate their own institution before she has a chance to spin the narrative her way. People protect institutions fiercely once they understand they were the ones being used, not just bystanders to someone else's family drama. Grace had been listening from the doorway, still in yesterday's clothes, having not slept more than an hour the entire night. What about the message where she threatens to use the Whitfield story? Does that go to the board too? It goes to the board, Renata confirmed, because it's the clearest evidence we have that this entire concern for Emma's welfare narrative was constructed, not discovered. A woman genuinely worried about a child's home environment doesn't offer the caregiver a settlement to disappear quietly. She goes through proper channels. What Vanessa did instead was attempt coercion, and she did it in writing, which frankly is the single biggest gift she could have given us. Ethan looked at Grace across the kitchen, something unspoken passing between them. Gratitude, maybe, or something that had been building between them for months now and had simply never had room to breathe under the weight of everything else happening around them. You kept those messages instead of panicking and deleting them the moment she threatened you, he said quietly. That took more presence of mind than most people would have managed. I learned the hard way that nobody believes you without proof, Grace said. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. What? The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of the Foundation's downtown headquarters, the kind of room designed to make everyone inside feel slightly more important than they actually were. Ethan had requested the meeting be moved up by a full day, citing urgent matters requiring immediate board attention, and Walter had quietly ensured the request went through without alerting Vanessa to exactly what those urgent matters might be. Vanessa arrived 12 minutes late, sweeping into the room in a sharp navy suit, clearly expecting to find Grace's signed resignation letter already circulating, expecting this meeting to be the formal, polite conclusion of a plan she believed had already succeeded. Instead, she found 7 trustees seated around the long table, a thick binder placed in front of each one of them, and Ethan Calloway standing at the head of the room with an expression she had apparently never seen on his face before. Not grief, not exhaustion, but something cold and controlled and entirely unfamiliar. Vanessa, Ethan said, his voice even. Please sit down. We have a lot to discuss. I wasn't aware this meeting had been moved up, Vanessa said carefully, taking her seat, her eyes flicking toward the binders with the first flicker of genuine uncertainty Grace had ever seen cross her face, watching from a chair near the back of the room where Ethan had insisted she be present, despite Vanessa's clear discomfort at seeing her there at all. There was a scheduling conflict, Ethan said simply. Walter, would you like to begin? Walter Briggs stood, adjusting his glasses, and opened his copy of the binder with the steady, unhurried authority of a man who had earned the right to be taken seriously in this room decades before Vanessa Holloway had ever set foot in it. 18 months ago, this board approved 4 new trustee appointments, Walter began, his voice carrying easily across the room. I'd like to walk everyone through the actual documentation behind 2 of those appointments, because there are some significant irregularities I believe the board needs to be aware of before any further decisions are made today. Vanessa's hand moved slightly toward her phone, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. And Grace watched Ethan notice it too, watched him say nothing, simply letting Walter continue. For the next 20 minutes, Walter walked the trustees through the timeline, the consent forms supposedly signed by trustees who were verifiably out of the country on the dates in question, the inconsistent signature analysis a forensic document examiner had completed overnight at Renata's request, The bank records showing the donation to Margaret Chen's husband's gallery that had occurred within 2 weeks of her appointment being finalized. The room had gone very quiet. Margaret Chen herself sat frozen near the middle of the table, her face draining of color as the documentation made clear exactly how her own appointment had been engineered, and Grace realized, watching her, that Margaret had likely had no idea the forms behind her own approval were fraudulent. She'd simply been useful to Vanessa, the same way Grace had once been useful to the Whitfields, right up until she wasn't. "This is absurd," Vanessa said finally, her voice sharper now, the polish starting to crack. "You're suggesting I forged board signatures. Based on what? Some amateur handwriting comparison and circumstantial timing?" "Based on a certified forensic document analysis, and the simple fact that 2 trustees have already confirmed in writing that they were traveling internationally and never signed any consent forms on the dates listed," Renata said, standing now, sliding copies of those written confirmations down the table. "But that's not actually the most significant piece of evidence we have today, Ms. Holloway." Vanessa's eyes moved to Renata, then to Ethan, then, finally, to Grace, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Grace saw something like real fear flicker across that carefully composed face. "Grace," Ethan said quietly, "would you like to share the messages?" Grace stood, her legs unsteady but her voice clear, and read aloud the text messages exactly as they'd been sent. The demand for a signed resignation, the threat to release the Whitfield story to multiple outlets simultaneously, the explicit promise to push for a custody evaluation by manufacturing concerns about Ethan's judgment. The room listened in absolute silence, several trustees exchanging glances Grace couldn't quite read, until she finished and sat back down, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "This is a private matter that's been completely twisted out of context," Vanessa said, but her voice had lost the smooth, unshakable confidence it had carried for 2 years. "I was simply trying to handle a delicate situation discreetly, for the family's sake, away from public scrutiny. You offered a financial settlement in exchange for her resignation and silence, and you explicitly threatened to manufacture false concerns about my fitness as a father if she refused," Ethan said, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge now that made Vanessa visibly flinch. "There is no version of that, Vanessa, that reads as concern for Emma, that reads as coercion, plain and simple, and you put it in writing." One of the older trustees, a quiet woman named Eleanor Park, who had served on the board for nearly 20 years and had said almost nothing throughout the entire presentation, finally spoke up. "I think," she said slowly, looking around the table, "that we need to discuss formally removing Ms. Holloway from this board, effective immediately, and voiding the votes of any trustee whose appointment cannot be independently verified as legitimate." "Second that," said another older trustee immediately. Vanessa's composure finally broke completely. "You're all going to believe a nanny's word over mine? Over a family member who's been part of this foundation for years?" "We're not believing a nanny's word," Eleanor said, her voice gaining a steel that surprised even Grace. "We're believing documented evidence, forensic analysis, and your own text messages, which you apparently didn't think anyone else would ever see. This isn't about who we like more, Vanessa. It's about what actually happened, and what actually happened is fraud." The vote, when it came, was unanimous among the legitimately appointed trustees, 5 in favor of immediate removal, with Margaret Chen and Robert Stillwell abstaining entirely, their own positions on the board now in serious question, pending further review of how exactly they'd been appointed in the first place. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, gathering her things with hands that weren't quite steady, despite her best efforts to look unbothered. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at Ethan, her voice low and tight. "You think a binder of documents erases 2 years of work? I will appeal this. I will fight this in every way available to me." "You're welcome to," Renata said calmly, still standing at the table. "But I'd advise you to consult an attorney first regarding the criminal exposure for the forged consent forms, because at this point, that's a separate and significant problem that exists entirely independent of whatever appeal you might attempt with this board." Vanessa's face went pale at the word criminal, and for just a moment the mask slipped entirely, revealing something exhausted and frightened underneath all the careful composure she'd worn for 2 years. Then she straightened, gathered the last of her dignity, and walked out of the conference room without another word, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final click that somehow felt louder than any slammed door could have. He sat. The aftermath unfolded over the following week in a series of quiet procedural steps that felt almost anticlimactic compared to the explosive confrontation in the conference room. But Grace had learned by now that real resolution rarely looked as dramatic as the conflict that preceded it. The board formally voted to remove Vanessa from her position entirely, citing the documented fraud and coercion. Margaret Chen and Robert Stillwell, once they understood the full extent of how their own appointments had been engineered without their knowledge, cooperated fully with the investigation, providing additional context that helped Walter and Renata build an even clearer picture of how long Vanessa had been quietly maneuvering behind the scenes. Neither faced removal themselves, given they'd had no knowledge of the fraud, though both stepped back from any involvement in matters concerning Emma's guardianship going forward, citing a need to rebuild trust with the rest of the board first. The custody concerns, once formally reviewed by the actual legitimate board members, dissolved within days, with Eleanor Park personally drafting a statement confirming there had never been legitimate grounds for any evaluation of Ethan's fitness as Emma's father, and that the entire matter had originated from manufactured concerns designed to serve one trustee's personal agenda rather than any genuine welfare issue. The press, predictably, found out within days, not through any leak from Ethan's team, but through court filings related to the criminal complaint Renata eventually advised Ethan to pursue regarding the forged documents, filings that became public record the moment they were submitted. The story that emerged this time was entirely different from the one Vanessa had spent 2 years carefully constructing. Billionaire's sister-in-law removed from foundation board amid fraud allegations. Sources: Holloway manufactured custody concerns to seize control of family trust. Ethan had braced himself for another wave of brutal headlines about his personal life. But this time, the public's sympathy had shifted entirely. People didn't see a grieving widower making reckless choices anymore. They saw a man who had been quietly fighting for his family against someone determined to tear it apart for her own gain, and Grace, once painted as a suspicious opportunist, was now occasionally referenced in passing as the nanny who refused to be bought. A small detail that made Grace laugh tiredly the first time she read it, because it was such a strange, simplified version of what had actually happened, and yet somehow it had landed on something true. But none of that mattered nearly as much. In the days that followed, as the quiet, ordinary moments that started slowly returning to the lake house, moments that had been crowded out by crisis for weeks, and were only now finding their way back. It was a Tuesday evening, almost 2 weeks after the board meeting, when Ethan found Grace in the kitchen again, exactly the way he had that very first morning months ago. Except this time Emma was already asleep upstairs, the house quiet around them, the immediate danger finally, fully past. "I keep thinking about something Vanessa said," Grace admitted, leaning against the counter, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, "about people getting caught in something bigger than themselves. The same way it happened with the Whitfields." She was wrong, though. Ethan moved closer, leaning against the same counter, close enough now that Grace could feel the warmth coming off him. "With the Whitfields, you got caught in someone else's cruelty and had no power to fight back. This time, you had the power, and you used it. That's not the same thing happening twice. That's you finally getting the outcome you should have gotten the first time, just years too late." Grace looked down at her tea, turning the mug slowly in her hands. "I almost took the money, Ethan. Standing in that cafe for 30 seconds, I almost just said yes and walked away from all of this. From you. From Emma. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." She looked up at him then, something raw and unguarded in her expression that she hadn't let herself show him before, not even during the worst of the last few weeks. "I keep trying to figure out why this time felt different, why I had it in me to fight when I didn't before." Ethan reached out gently and took the mug from her hands, setting it aside on the counter, freeing both her hands to hold instead. "Maybe because this time you had people who actually believed you the moment you told them the truth," he said quietly. "Maybe that's the only difference that ever mattered. Not how strong you were, just whether anyone bothered to listen." The space between them had closed almost entirely now, and Grace found herself looking up at him, very aware of how close he'd gotten, very aware of the particular, careful way he was looking at her, like he was finally allowing himself something he'd been holding back for months. "Ethan," she said softly, "what are we doing?" "I think," he said, his voice low, "I'm finally admitting something I should have admitted the day a stranger took our picture on that dock and asked if we were a family." His thumb moved gently across her knuckles. "I don't want you to just work here anymore, Grace. I haven't wanted that in a long time, if I'm honest. I think some part of me wanted it from the very first week, watching you crouch down to Emma's level and ask her about dinosaurs instead of talking over her head the way every other nanny did." Grace's breath caught. "I'm not... Ethan, I don't have anything. No money, no family connections, nothing close to the kind of life you're used to. People are still going to look at us and see exactly what Vanessa tried to convince everyone we were." "I don't care what people see," Ethan said firmly. "I care what's actually true. And what's true is that you walked into the worst version of my life 2 years after I lost the person I thought I'd spend my whole life with. And somehow, without trying to, you made this house feel like a home again. You stayed when leaving would have been easier. You fought for Emma like she was your own when nobody would have blamed you for protecting yourself instead." He paused, his expression softening even further. "I don't think I'm in love with you because of what you can offer me, Grace. I think I'm in love with you, despite everything you've been told you have to offer to be worth loving." The words landed in the quiet kitchen with a weight that felt almost too large for the small space, and Grace felt tears gathering before she could stop them. Not from sadness this time, but from something that had been building in her chest for months without ever finding a name she felt allowed to use. "I love her," Grace said softly, meaning Emma, meaning all of it. "I think I've loved her since that first interview, when she told me she wouldn't choose between unicorns and dinosaurs. And I think I've loved you for a while now too, longer than I let myself admit, because admitting it felt like setting myself up to lose everything all over again." "You're not going to lose this," Ethan said, pulling her gently against him, his arms wrapping around her in a way that felt entirely different from any embrace they'd shared before. Not careful, not restrained, but certain. "Vanessa's gone. The board's settled. Emma adores you. And I have spent 2 years convinced I'd already lost everything that mattered, only to find out the most important parts were still here, waiting the entire time. I'm not letting that go now that I finally understand what it actually is." They stood together in the quiet kitchen for a long time after that, neither one in any hurry to move, the house around them finally, completely silent, in the easy way houses go quiet when nothing dangerous is waiting in the dark anymore. Upstairs, unbeknownst to either of them, Emma had woken briefly, padding to the top of the stairs in her pajamas the way she sometimes did when the house felt too quiet, and had paused there, peering down through the railing at her father and Grace, standing together in the kitchen below, his arms around her, both of them quiet and still in a way that looked, even to a 4-year-old's eyes, entirely different from how the house had felt for the past 2 years. She didn't fully understand everything that had happened over the last few weeks. The strange phone calls, the angry headlines on Daddy's computer, the way Grace had seemed sad and distracted for days before suddenly seeming lighter again. But she understood, in the simple, direct way that children understand the things that actually matter, that whatever had been wrong before seemed to be right again now. She padded back to her room quietly, climbed into bed, and fell back asleep with the easy, untroubled rest of a child who finally, instinctively, trusted that everything in her world had settled back into its proper place. She had no idea yet that her father was about to ask Grace a question that would change all three of their lives permanently, or that the answer Grace gave would finally put to rest, once and for all, the quiet fears she'd carried since she was 30 years old, and learned the hard way that love for someone else's child could be taken away in an instant, no matter how real or deep that love actually was. 3 weeks passed before the criminal complaint against Vanessa moved through the early stages of the legal system, and in that time, the lake house settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in how ordinary it was. No headlines waiting on Ethan's laptop in the morning, no careful phone calls with Priya about narrative control. Just breakfast, and Emma's endless negotiations over marshmallow sorting, and the particular quiet that comes when a house finally stops bracing for the next blow. Vanessa, it turned out, did not fight as hard as she'd promised in that conference room. Her attorney, once he'd reviewed the forensic document analysis and the text message evidence in full, advised her quickly and bluntly that contesting the board's decision would only invite deeper scrutiny into the forged signatures, scrutiny that could escalate from a civil matter into something with real criminal weight. She accepted a settlement that kept the matter mostly out of further public filings, paid a substantial fine, and agreed to permanent removal from any role connected to the Calloway Family Foundation. The criminal complaint regarding the forged consent forms remained open for several more months, working through the slow machinery of the legal system, but Renata assured Ethan that the documentation was airtight enough that Vanessa's lawyers were already negotiating a plea rather than risking trial. She did not contact Ethan again. She did not contact Grace. The last anyone heard, she'd moved to a different city entirely, the kind of quiet disappearance reserved for people whose names had become too costly to keep using in the circles they used to move through. Ethan thought about her sometimes, in the early mornings when the lake was still and gray before the sun fully came up. Not with hatred exactly, though there had been plenty of that in the days right after the conference room. What was left now, weeks later, was something closer to a tired, complicated sadness. For Diane, mostly, who would have been horrified to see what her sister had become in the name of protecting a family, Diane herself had never asked anyone to protect through cruelty. He mentioned this once to Grace, late one night on the porch, the same spot where they'd first really talked about everything that mattered. "I don't think Vanessa ever actually figured out how to grieve Diane," he said quietly. "I think she just found a project instead, something to control because control felt safer than actually feeling what she'd lost." "That doesn't make what she did to you and Emma okay," Grace said. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't. But it helps me understand it without it eating me alive every time I think about her. I have to let it go eventually, for Emma's sake, if nothing else. I don't want her growing up watching her father carry around 2 years of bitterness towards someone who used to come to Sunday dinners." Grace reached over and took his hand, and they sat together for a long while, watching the dark water, neither one needing to fill the silence with anything more. The proposal, when it finally came, was not the grand orchestrated event Grace might have expected from a man with Ethan's resources. There was no string quartet, no rented-out restaurant, no carefully staged photograph for some lifestyle magazine eager to run the redemption story of the billionaire and his nanny-turned-fiancée. Ethan had learned enough over the last several weeks about the cost of public spectacle to want absolutely none of it for this. It happened on a Saturday morning in October, almost 3 months after the board meeting, on the same dock where the photograph that started everything had been taken. The leaves along the shoreline had turned, gold and rust-colored, scattering across the water in a way that made the lake look entirely different from the bright blue summer afternoon when a stranger had asked to photograph what she thought was a family. Emma had wanted to feed the ducks, a new obsession that had replaced the dinosaur phase sometime in September. And Grace had walked down with her, a bag of breadcrumbs in hand, while Ethan trailed slightly behind them with his hands in his pockets, quiet in a way Grace noticed but didn't think much of at the time. "Daddy's being weird," Emma announced, tossing a piece of bread toward a duck that immediately lost interest the moment a more aggressive duck shoved past it. "Daddy's always a little weird," Grace said. "I can hear both of you," Ethan called from behind them, and Emma giggled, delighted, the way she always was when she successfully got a reaction out of an adult. They stayed at the dock until the bread ran out, until Emma had named at least 4 of the ducks and assigned them elaborate personalities and backstories that made Grace laugh harder than she had in weeks. And it was only after Emma had wandered a few feet away, distracted by a particularly stubborn squirrel, that Ethan finally took a breath and said her name. "Grace." Something in his tone made her turn fully toward him, and she found him already down on one knee on the worn wooden planks of the dock, a small velvet box open in his hand, his expression doing something complicated and vulnerable that she'd rarely seen from him, even during the worst of everything they'd been through together. "Ethan." Her hand came up to her mouth, the breadcrumb bag forgotten, falling from her other hand onto the dock. "I've thought about how to do this for weeks," he said, his voice slightly unsteady in a way that made it land even harder than careful words might have. "I thought about somewhere fancy, somewhere with all the things people expect from someone like me. And then I realized none of that actually matters, because the only place that's ever felt true between us is right here. This exact dock, this exact lake, where a stranger looked at the three of us and saw something real before either of us let ourselves believe it. He swallowed hard. Grace Foster, I'm not asking you to marry a billionaire or to take on some life that comes with cameras and headlines and people who'll never stop having opinions about where you came from. I'm asking you to marry the man you've been quietly building a family with for almost a year now, whether either of us called it that at the time or not. I'm asking because I don't want one more morning where you're anything less than mine, and Emma's completely, with nothing left to prove to anyone. Grace was crying before he finished, the kind of crying that came without any effort to stop it, and somewhere behind them, Emma had noticed something was happening and was now standing very still, watching with wide, curious eyes. Yes, Grace said, the word coming out thick and immediate, no hesitation left in her at all. Yes, Ethan. He stood, slipping the ring onto her finger with hands that weren't entirely steady either, and pulled her into him. And for a moment neither of them noticed Emma had run the last few feet toward them until she was wrapping her small arms around both of their legs at once, demanding to know what was happening in the loud, insistent way of a child who refused to be left out of important news. Grace is going to be your mom now, Ethan said, crouching down to her level, his voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding from his daughter. Officially, forever. Is that okay with you? Emma considered this with the same seriousness she brought to sorting marshmallows, looking back and forth between them, and then said, with the simple, devastating clarity only a 4-year-old could manage, I already decided that a long time ago. You guys just took forever to catch up. Grace laughed through her tears, pulling Emma into the embrace alongside Ethan, the three of them standing together on the same weathered dock where everything had both nearly fallen apart and somehow finally come together, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace let herself believe completely that this happiness wasn't something she had to be careful with, wasn't something that could be taken from her the moment someone decided she didn't deserve to keep it. The wedding, when it happened the following spring, was small and deliberately unglamorous by Calloway family standards. No more than 60 guests, held in the garden behind the lake house rather than any of the venues Ethan's social circle might have expected. Dolores cried through the entire ceremony, standing near the front with the quiet pride of a woman who had watched this family nearly come apart and had refused to let it. Walter Briggs gave a short toast at the reception that made several guests laugh, and several others reached quietly for tissues, talking about how the foundation had nearly lost its way entirely before a woman with more integrity than half the board combined had walked in and reminded everyone what the institution was actually supposed to stand for. Eleanor Park, who had become something of an unexpected mentor to Grace over the months since the board meeting, gave her a small, knowing smile from across the garden that said, more than any toast could have. Emma served as flower girl, taking the responsibility with the same fierce seriousness she brought to everything, scattering petals along the aisle with the focused precision of someone defusing a bomb, occasionally pausing to glare at any petal that landed in a spot she found unsatisfactory. Grace wore a simple dress that had nothing to do with designer labels or 7-figure budgets, and when she walked down the aisle toward Ethan, past faces that had once doubted her, past the empty space where Vanessa would have stood had things gone differently, she found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of Lily, the little girl she'd lost 4 years earlier, the one whose face still sometimes appeared in her mind during quiet moments, unbidden and aching. She hoped, in some small way she couldn't fully explain even to herself, that wherever Lily was now, however much or little she remembered of the woman who used to read to her every night, some part of her had grown up okay, that losing Grace hadn't broken something permanent in her the way Grace had once feared it might. She made a silent promise, somewhere between her seat and the altar where Ethan stood waiting, that Emma would never know what that kind of loss felt like, not as long as Grace had any say in it. 2 years later, the lake house had changed in small, lived-in ways that no decorator could have planned. A child's drawings taped haphazardly to the refrigerator, a stack of well-worn picture books permanently relocated to the living room coffee table, scuff marks along the kitchen floor from years of small feet running back and forth, chasing things that mattered intensely for exactly 30 seconds before being forgotten. Emma was 6 now, missing her 2 front teeth, fiercely opinionated about everything from breakfast cereal to which duck on the lake deserved to be considered the unofficial leader of the flock. She called Grace Mom now, naturally, without any of the careful negotiation either Ethan or Grace had expected, might be necessary when that transition finally happened. It had simply occurred one ordinary Tuesday, mid-sentence, Emma asking Grace to help her find a missing shoe, and neither of them had made a single comment about it afterward, because making a comment would have suggested it was something unusual instead of something that had simply, naturally, become true. Ethan had restructured the Foundation's board entirely in the aftermath of everything, instituting new appointment protocols that required multiple independent verifications before any trustee could be confirmed, a policy that Walter, now technically retired but still serving in an advisory role, he refused to fully give up, liked to refer to as the Vanessa Clause, whenever new board members asked about its origin. Grace, for her part, had eventually stepped back from the formal nanny role, not because anything required it, but because somewhere in the last 2 years, the work had simply transformed into something that no job title quite captured anymore. She'd started volunteering with a local organization that supported domestic workers facing exactly the kind of unfounded accusations and unfair dismissals she herself had once survived, using both her own story and a portion of the resources now available to her to help women who didn't have a Billionaire's legal team willing to fight on their behalf the way she'd been lucky enough to have. "You didn't have to do any of that," Ethan told her once, watching her review case files at the kitchen table late one evening. The same table where Walter had once spread out forged signatures and built the case that saved their family. "I know I didn't have to," Grace said, not looking up from the file in front of her. "But I spent 4 years believing nobody would ever believe a woman like me over a man with money and reputation. I got lucky, Ethan. I got lucky that you actually listened instead of assuming the worst. Most women in this situation don't get that. I can't fix the whole system, but I can make sure at least some of them have somebody fighting alongside them, the way you fought for me." It was a quiet kind of work, the kind that never made headlines the way the scandal involving Vanessa had, but Grace had come to understand something over the years that she tried, gently, to pass along to every woman she worked with through the organization. The truth mattering wasn't something that happened automatically just because it was true. Someone had to choose to listen. Someone had to choose to believe a person with less power, less money, less standing in the world, over the convenient, comfortable version of events that protected someone with more. That choice was the entire difference between justice and silence, and it rarely came from the powerful person doing the right thing out of pure goodness. It came from people building enough evidence, enough courage, enough refusal to disappear quietly that the truth simply became too loud to ignore anymore. She thought often about how close she'd come to taking Vanessa's money that day in the cafe, how easy it would have been to disappear again, to protect herself the only way she'd ever learned how to protect herself, by removing herself entirely from a situation too dangerous to fight. She understood now, with the clarity that only comes from looking backward at a decision that could have gone either way, that the difference between that outcome and the one she actually got hadn't been luck alone. It had been the simple, terrifying choice to trust that someone might actually believe her this time, paired with the willingness to gather proof instead of just hoping belief would arrive on its own. On a warm evening in early June, almost exactly 3 years after a stranger had first asked to photograph what she thought was a family on a quiet lakeside dock, Ethan stood at the same window in his study where he'd once watched rain streak the glass and felt like the loneliest man on the eastern seaboard. The window looked exactly the same. The lake beyond it looked exactly the same, calm and silver under a clear summer sky. But the house behind him sounded entirely different now. Downstairs, Emma was loudly negotiating bedtime terms with Grace, who was matching her daughter's stubbornness with the same patient, unhurried firmness she'd shown from the very first week she'd walked through their door, wearing a coat too big for her. 5 more minutes, Emma insisted. 2 more minutes, Grace countered. And only because you actually brushed your teeth without me asking 4 times like usual. 3 minutes. You're a terrible negotiator, but I respect the effort. Fine. 3 minutes. Ethan smiled, listening from the top of the stairs, and thought about how strange it was that the thing he'd once mourned most, the easy, ordinary noise of a full house, the particular chaos of bedtime negotiations and breakfast arguments and a child's laughter echoing through rooms that used to feel too large and too quiet, had come back to him not by some accident of fate, but because one woman had refused to walk away when walking away would have been so much easier, and because he himself had finally learned in the hardest possible way that protecting the people you love sometimes means fighting loudly instead of staying quiet and hoping the danger passes on its own. He thought about Diane sometimes still, in moments like this, though the grief had changed shape over the years into something softer, something that coexisted now with genuine happiness instead of standing in opposition to it. He liked to believe, in the quiet way people believe things they can't prove but need to anyway, that she would have liked Grace, that she would have approved of someone who loved Emma not because of what the Calloway name could offer, but despite every reason the world had given her to believe love like that only ever got taken away in the end. Vanessa's name came up rarely now, mostly in passing, mostly without much weight attached to it anymore. She had become, over the years, less a wound and more a lesson, a reminder of how easily grief, left unexamined, could curdle into something that justified almost any cruelty in the name of protecting what you'd already lost. Ethan hoped, somewhere in the distance of whatever life she was living now, that she'd eventually found her own version of peace, the kind that didn't require controlling anyone else's family to feel complete. He hoped it without forgiving what she'd done, because he'd learned those two things. Hoping someone finds peace and forgiving the damage they caused along the way didn't always have to arrive together and didn't need to. He walked downstairs as Emma's 3 negotiated minutes finally ran out, found Grace tucking her into bed, the soft yellow glow of the nightlight casting long shadows across the walls Emma had decorated over the years. With an evolving gallery of crayon drawings that had moved from dinosaurs to unicorns to, more recently, an extended and somewhat alarming series depicting the entire duck population of the lake in elaborate detail. "Good night, baby," Grace murmured, kissing Emma's forehead. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Daddy." Emma's eyes were already drooping, the day's stubbornness dissolving into the particular total exhaustion only small children seem capable of achieving so completely. "Tomorrow, can we feed the ducks again?" "We can always feed the ducks," Ethan said, leaning down to kiss her forehead too. "The ducks aren't going anywhere." "Good," Emma mumbled, already half asleep. "I like that the ducks stay." Grace and Ethan stood together in the doorway for a moment, watching her drift off completely, and then walked downstairs hand in hand, into a kitchen that smelled like the dinner they hadn't quite finished cleaning up, into a house that had weathered exactly the kind of storm that destroys some families completely, and had come out the other side not unscathed but stronger, more honest, more certain of what actually mattered once everything false had been stripped away. Outside, the lake sat still and quiet under the early summer evening, the same water that had once carried a small wooden boat past a sunning turtle, the same dock where a stranger's casual kindness had set off a chain of events neither Ethan nor Grace could have predicted, and the same shoreline where, years from now, Emma would likely bring her own complicated, ordinary problems to discuss with 2 parents who had learned, through everything, exactly how much it mattered to listen, to believe, and to fight for the people worth fighting for instead of simply hoping the truth would defend itself. Because that, in the end, was the only real lesson worth taking from any of it. Not that money solves everything, because it hadn't. Not really. Not until it was paired with people willing to use it honestly. Not that love alone conquers every obstacle, because love hadn't been enough on its own either. Not without courage and proof, and the stubborn refusal to disappear quietly when disappearing would have been so much easier. The lesson, if there was one, was simpler and harder than either of those things. That the people who deserve to be believed are rarely the ones with the most power in the room, and that real love, the kind worth building a life around, shows up not in grand gestures or convenient timing, but in the quiet, unglamorous decision to stay, to fight, and to choose someone again and again, long after the easier choice would have been to walk away.